Imagine that we're back in the late 1980s or early 1990s and you're feeling depressed and nobody wants to talk to you, so you pay a psychiatrist to listen to your problems, but even after talking things out with your shrink, you're still not feeling great and all hope seems lost. Then the shrink tells you not to despair because you have an opportunity to participate in a clinical trial for a new class of drug that has the potential to cure all of your symptoms called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs. And if you enter the trial, you have a chance of getting the new SSRI drug, or you could get a placebo that does nothing. But you're told it's a win-win. You know, if you participate in the clinical trial, Big Pharma will get some more data on whether this new class of drug actually works, and you have a chance of being cured. If you're not cured, then in all likelihood, the worst case scenario is not a big deal. Either you get a placebo and nothing changes, or you get the real drug, which has relatively modest side effects like dry mouth, nausea, dizziness, and so on. In exchange for enduring those side effects, your depression might go away. So what do you have to lose? Well, this was the process that drug companies used to convince the world that SSRIs worked. After running a bunch of double-blind clinical trials, they found that people who took the SSRIs ultimately reported that they felt better than people who received the placebo. And therefore, we were told that the whole serotonin theory of depression must be true. After all, when people took SSRIs and had more serotonin in their brains, their depression went away. People who took the sugar pill didn't do as well, so there you have it. Science wins again. But there's a major problem with this whole methodology, and it's a problem that somehow didn't occur to any of the media outlets or physicians who pushed SSRIs for many decades. And you might have to think about it for a few minutes, but eventually it becomes obvious. Here's the issue. In practice, these clinical trials were not actually double-blind studies. The vast majority of patients were able to break blind, as they say in the industry, and that means they were able to figure out whether they got the real SSRI or the placebo, which destroys the whole study. And that's because in most cases, the patients who got the real drug very quickly noticed that they were experiencing some of the side effects. After all, if you take a pill and you start experiencing dry mouth or nausea or something like that, then you'll probably conclude that you're taking an active medication. And that's exactly what happened in many of these trials. In fact, one study conducted by researchers at Columbia says that 89% of participants correctly guessed that they were on the SSRI, which is an extremely high number for a clinical trial. Now, you could probably see the issue, hopefully. If the studies aren't really double-blind, then we have no way of knowing if the SSRIs actually improved people's minds. It's quite possible that these patients were actually feeling better because they thought they were taking a wonder drug. And because we're talking about people's emotional state, which is very fickle and highly suggestible, if you tell them they're taking a wonder drug that will make them feel better, a lot of people will just feel better because you told them that they would. And they convinced themselves that it was working, so they told the therapist that they were improving. And this is commonly referred to as the placebo effect, of course. And the only way to defeat it, particularly when you're trying to assess the effectiveness of psychoactive drugs, is with double-blind studies. But that didn't really happen with SSRIs. And this is not some crackpot theory, by the way. A few years ago, a researcher at Harvard named Irving Kirsch found that, quote, analysis of the published data and the unpublished data that were hidden by drug companies reveals that most, if not all, of the benefits are due to the placebo effect. The relatively small differences between drug and placebo in antidepressant trials are at least in part due to breaking blind and discerning that one is in the drug group because of the side effects produced by the drug. Now, Kirsch goes on to suggest that instead of SSRIs, maybe all patients should just be given a placebo. After all, based on the FDA's data, less than 45% of SSRI trials showed a statistically significant benefit of the SSRI over a placebo. And the placebo, of course, has no side effects. But as we all know, there's no money in prescribing sugar pills. So instead, doctors in the pharmaceutical industry pushed SSRIs based on these garbage clinical trials, which fall apart under the slimmest possible scrutiny. The use of SSRIs among teenagers and adults in this country increased by almost 400% from the early 1990s to 2006, and it kept going up. By 2014, 1 in 10 adults was filling an SSRI prescription. From 2015 to 2021, SSRI use increased by another 35%. So we're talking about tens of millions of prescriptions here. And meanwhile, the number of Americans suffering from depression has only kept increasing. According to Gallup in 2023, the percentage of U.S. adults who reported having been diagnosed with depression at some point in their lifetime reached 29%, nearly 10 percentage points higher than in 2015. So, in other words, we are more depressed than ever, and at the same time, we're taking more antidepressants than ever. And if antidepressants are actually working, then you should see that trend going in the opposite direction, but it's not. Now, these prescriptions have continued even after one of the most prominent medical journals on the planet admitted that actually doctors no longer think that low serotonin levels are linked to depression. In other words, if these drugs actually work, then no one can really explain why. Quoting from the journal Molecular Psychiatry, our comprehensive review of the major strands of research on serotonin show there is no convincing evidence that depression is associated with or caused by lower serotonin concentrations or activity. Most studies found no evidence of reduced serotonin activity in people with depression compared to people without. This review suggests that the huge research effort based on the serotonin hypothesis has not produced convincing evidence of a biochemical basis to depression. I'll say that again. This review suggests that the huge research effort based on the serotonin hypothesis has not produced convincing evidence of a biochemical basis to depression. This was a paper published in the summer of 2022 by one of the top journals in the entire field of medicine. And yet, to this day, if you suggest that depression is not related to a chemical imbalance, if you suggest that it is not biochemical, which is what that study showed, that it's not biochemical, then you will still be dogpiled for doing so. I mean, it's been impossible to have anything approaching an honest conversation about depression and SSRIs in this country because many of the people on these drugs will just lash out with blind rage if you even suggest that depression might have causes that go deeper than chemical imbalances. If you try to talk about the problem of despair, which is what depression is, if you try to talk about it with any depth or nuance at all, you're screamed out of the room by drug addicts who don't know they're drug addicts. But the truth is that none of the support for SSRIs is based on reality. The whole class of drugs has been peddled to tens of millions of people based on complete fabrications, based on bad studies, and based on bunk theories. It is not an overstatement to say this is one of the great medical scandals of our time. What's changing now is that finally someone in a position of authority is willing to investigate these drugs and many other drugs like them. A few days ago, via executive order, the Trump administration established something called the Make America Healthy Again Commission, or MAHA, and MAHA, I guess maybe is how you pronounce it. And it'll be headed by RFK Jr. And the purpose of the commission, according to the White House, is to determine why Americans have shorter life expectancies than people living in other nations, as well as higher rates of chronic diseases like cancer and asthma. And part of this effort means assessing the, quote, prevalence of and threat posed by the prescription of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, stimulants, and weight loss drugs. Watch.
Last Thursday, President Trump signed an executive order to establish the MAHA Commission to study what has caused the precipitous decline in American health over the past 2 generations. So we will convene representatives of all viewpoints to study the causes for the drastic rise in chronic disease. Some of the possible factors we will investigate were formerly taboo or insufficiently scrutinized. The childhood vaccine schedule, electromagnetic radiation, glyphosate, other pesticides, ultra-processed foods, artificial food additives, SSRI and other psychiatric drugs, PFAs, PFOAs, microplastics. Nothing is going to be off limits.
As of right now, as you heard, RFK's commission is going to be focused on gathering data. You know, they're not banning anything outright. They're not punishing doctors for prescribing anything. Instead, they're doing what the government should have done several decades ago. They're looking at the existing evidence and determining whether it's valid or not. They're not going to simply accept clinical trials without looking closely at them. They're going to see whether it makes sense to keep prescribing these drugs to so many Americans, particularly young people. Now, you have to wonder what kind of person would object to a fact-finding effort like this. After all, if SSRIs and other drugs that he mentioned actually work as advertised, then the extra scrutiny wouldn't be a problem at all. But RFK Jr. has received a lot of pushback because of this. Newsweek, for example, recently took aim at RFK's claim that antidepressants can be more addictive than heroin. They cited a Stanford professor as saying, quote, "Antidepressants and heroin are in different universes when it comes to addiction risk. In my 35 years in the addiction field, I've met only 2 or 3 people who thought they were addicted to antidepressants versus thousands who were addicted to heroin and other opioids." Did you notice the qualifier there? I've met only 2 or 3 people who thought they were addicted to antidepressants. So one thing we could take away from that is that people who take these drugs tend to be in a lot of denial. And I think the very idea that you could become addicted to them doesn't occur to a lot of the people taking these drugs. They don't even think that that's a thing that can happen. And so when they have this compulsion to keep taking the antidepressant, they don't see it as an addiction. And according to this addiction specialist, because they don't see it as an addiction, it isn't one. I mean, this is the kind of quote unquote science that's behind so much of the psychiatric field. And it's what has propelled millions of people to end up on these drugs is this kind of totally bunk, ridiculous nonsense that they call science. So we're meant to conclude that RFK is a conspiracy theorist for even suggesting that SSRIs can cause dependency. But just a few years ago, that was not a conspiracy theory at all. It was settled science. Being a husband, father, and host of my own show means life never slows down. Imagine trying to eat 31 different fruits and vegetables every day. Sounds miserable and time-consuming, but with Balance of Nature fruits and veggies, there's never been a more convenient dietary supplement to ensure you get a wide variety of fruits and vegetables every day with 31 different whole fruit and vegetable ingredients. Balance of Nature takes fruits and vegetables and freeze-dries them, turns them into a powder, and puts them in a capsule. You take your fruit and veggie capsule every day, and then your body knows what to do with them. Go to balanceofnature.com and use promo code Walsh for 35% off your first order as a preferred customer. Plus, get a free bottle of fiber and spice. That's balanceofnature.com, promo code Walsh. In 2018, the New York Times published an article titled, "Many people taking antidepressants discover they cannot quit." Here's some of the relevant findings. Quote, "In New Zealand, where prescriptions are at historic highs, a survey of long-term users found that withdrawal was the most common complaint, cited by 3/4 of longtime users. In a recent survey of 250 long-term users of psychiatric drugs, most commonly antidepressants, about half who wound down their prescriptions rated the withdrawal as severe. Nearly half who tried to quit could not do so because of these symptoms. In another study of 180 longtime antidepressant users, withdrawal symptoms were reported by more than 130. Almost half said they felt addicted to antidepressants." Close quote. Now, if you compare those numbers to the percentage of heroin users who become addicted within a month of using the drug, you'll find that RFK actually has a point. By one estimate, up to 38% of new heroin users become dependent within a year, which is a lot, obviously, but it's less than the number of antidepressant users who reported feeling severe withdrawal symptoms. And this is why RFK's commission is an important step. It's clear that we have a lot of evidence that antidepressants are causing far more harm than most people realize. But they're not seeing the evidence because it's being suppressed. And a transparent commission could solve that problem. It can also address this objection, which was just published by the left-wing outlet Mother Jones. Quote, "In a 2023 live stream on X with Elon Musk, RFK claimed that tremendous circumstantial evidence suggested that people taking antidepressants were more likely to commit school shootings. Actually, most school shooters were not taking those drugs, evidence shows." Close quote. Now, this is another common refrain you hear from the defenders, the apologists of for SSRIs. They say that most school shooters were not taking SSRIs. And as we've previously discussed, there are 2 major problems with that line. First of all, we don't actually know what drugs a school shooter was taking unless the family discloses it. The police and hospitals aren't going to tell anyone, citing privacy laws. And in pretty much no case does the family definitely state that the shooter wasn't taking certain kinds of medication. Secondly, a lot of mass shootings are really gang violence, and those incidents get lumped in with school shootings, so they flood the data set and make it hard to determine whether SSRIs are influencing a certain kind of shooting. Now, anecdotally, of course, you'll find plenty of evidence that SSRIs might be linked to school shootings, from Columbine to Northern Illinois University, to the Navy Yard, to the movie theater in Aurora, Colorado, to the Black Church in Charleston, to the Old National Bank in Kentucky. The shooters were all confirmed to be on antidepressants. in response to these shootings, you might say that correlation doesn't prove causation. After all, these shooters were taking SSRIs because they were unstable. Doesn't necessarily prove that SSRIs made their condition worse, and that's true, but there is additional affirmative evidence to believe that SSRIs are in fact making these shooters' condition worse. For one thing, there's the FDA black box label on these drugs, which indicates that they can increase the risk of suicidal thinking and behavior. And there's this. A few years ago, researchers writing in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine found that the antidepressants doubled the risk of suicidality and violence when they were given to healthy people with no mental health disorders. And this is a direct quote from the journal. Antidepressants double the occurrence of events in adult healthy volunteers that can lead to suicide and violence. Now, how is that possible? How can a drug make someone violent and suicidal? How can a drug put violent suicidal thoughts in a person's head? How does that work? How does it work? Well, the truth is, we have no idea. The people prescribing the drugs have no idea. The people making the drugs have no idea. We have no clue why these drugs supposedly work in the first place, if they actually do work. And we have no idea why they might turn normal people into violent maniacs. But it's obviously a very concerning finding, especially given how much doctors are overprescribing these drugs to any patient who claims to be depressed. It is very, very, very easy to get an antidepressant drug. This is not a difficult thing to do. And the whole diagnostic process relies entirely on self-report. It is just you telling the doctor how you feel and what's going on with you, okay? It's why it's not like diagnosing a real physical illness where they can run tests and they can look at your body and they can detect that there are lesions, there are tumors, there are things going wrong in the body. But with these psychiatric illnesses, these alleged psychiatric illnesses, none of that exists. They're not doing brain scans. They're not looking at anything. It's just based on what you're telling them. Which means that anybody who wants to get any psychiatric drug can get it. Doctors would rather prescribe those drugs than tell patients the truth about their depression and how to deal with it. I can say that in my personal life, and this is anecdotal, but it's all anecdotal, okay? Everything is based on anecdotes. The diagnostic criteria is based on anecdotes. Everything is just anecdotes. It's just people telling stories about what's going on with them, people they know. That's what all this is. So I'll say that in my case, I've known many people who take antidepressants, and in almost every case, there are glaringly obvious things in their lives that would cause any normal person to be depressed. In almost every case, I can look at their life and say, well, yeah, I'd be kind of depressed too if I had this going on, right? So depression is actually a totally rational response to their circumstance. But instead of making lifestyle changes or dealing with the underlying trauma, they're given drugs that effectively numb their brain. They don't make them feel better, it just numbs them. So they don't feel the feeling anymore. But the thing that's causing the feeling is not being addressed. And it will never be addressed if you don't have the feeling that calls attention to the underlying problem. So it's just like giving someone a painkiller to make it hurt less when they put their hand on a hot stove. The stove is still burning them. The pain from the stove is not the problem, right? When you put your hand on a hot stove and it hurts, the hurting is not the problem. That's actually good. That means that your nervous system is working like it's supposed to. The pain is good. It's a good thing because it's alerting you to the fact that your hand is on a stove. So you have to take your hand off the stove. That's the solution. So the reason the medical establishment and Democrats are panicking over RFK's commission is simple. The moment people realize that they have agency, when they realize that they can take their hand off the stove, they become a lot harder to control. They also become a lot harder to monetize. For big pharma and corporate media outlets that sell advertising space to big pharma, the implications are obviously pretty dire. But for Americans hoping to reverse this country's long-standing public health decline after a generation of junk science and fake clinical trials, it's a change that's long overdue. Thanks for checking out this video. If you'd like to listen to my full podcast on the go, you can check out The Matt Walsh Show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.